the recording. So Konstantin, it's your turn.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Jan. Yeah, so hi everyone. Welcome back to our virtual fall school. My name is Konstantin Bülau. I'm a medical doctor, currently a postdoc in the brain simulation section. And I joined the lab last year. Can you actually see my presentation, by the way? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. And so I joined the lab last year, and that was also about the first time I came across the, let's say, world of ontologies. And this talk now may seem like the odd one out from our lecture series. But regarding its philosophical tradition and meaning, it makes sense, at least to me, to start with this topic. And I hope that I think I have some.
Leave it where it is. Might be in the hospital, preferably not. But if then it's in the hospital. If it's in a data
Can you maybe everyone mute themselves?
Muted.
Okay.
Where it is, move it around. That changes that already. It stays in one place. And then let's look.
Julie.
Sorry. I thought it was mute.
That's all right. Okay. So yeah, I hope that I will get you somewhat interested in the concepts of ontologies for this talk. And just one organizational thing up front. So two talks will actually switch times. So the talk by Paul Paoletta about the virtual research environment will take place on the 7th of December. And the talk by Jill will take place on the 30th of November now, about graph theory. So those will be super interesting talks, and both are great speakers. So I would highly recommend to attend both. Okay. So first, as an overview of the main sections. First, I will talk about what the ontologies in the original philosophical sense and their more modern interpretation. That is more dominated by an information scientific view. Then I will introduce the concept of the semantic web and its components. Then straight leading into the web ontology language and some tools that you would need to use if you want to build your own ontology. Then discuss some example ontologies that I find just very good, and some a biological application. And then at the end, try to answer or try to make the connection between biological ontologies and brain modeling as we do it with the virtual brain. Okay, so to get a good understanding of what an ontology actually is, we have to go way back in time, actually to the beginnings of philosophy in ancient Greece, and the philosophers who tried to build ontologies like Aristotle here on the right. And when we analyze the meaning of the word ontology, we see that it comes from, it's actually twofold. It comes from the word onto, which means being, or that which is, and the word logia, which means study or science. So ontology really means the study of being. And why is this important for philosophy? So philosophers really tried to use the concept of ontology to discuss questions, or to discuss challenging questions, to build theories and models, and to better understand the ontological status of the world. So they try to answer questions like, what is the world in its core made of? So what is the nature of existence? And or another question they try to answer, are physical parts more real than immaterial concepts? And this actually led to a to two rivaling beliefs. So on the one hand side, the ontological materialism, and on the other side, the idealism, ontological idealism. And basically, those two doctrines state that, so on the one hand side, the materialists said that physical matter, so something like particles, chemical processes, energy, is the only reality, and that everything, including thought, feeling, or mind, so typical human concepts, can be explained in terms of these material things. And on the other hand, the ontological idealism states that the reality is actually constructed in the mind of the observer. And yes, so everything, nothing exists outside of the human mind, basically. And some of the first, I call them bio-ontologists, were, of course, Aristotle, who actually probably contributed to any part of, to all part of philosophy and probably all nature sciences, but also contributed a lot to the world of ontologies. And so Aristotle in the 4th century BC made many contributions and also provided the first classification of organisms by shared properties, and used the genus differentiae nomenclature, which I will talk about on the next slide, which is basically the kind of one of the bases of the modern ontological nomenclature. And another kind of famous philosophical ontologist was Galen, who lived in around the 2nd century after Christ, and he focused on medical ontologies. So in particular, a systematic description of diseases, so signs of diseases and symptoms. And he also, in one of his description, used this genus differentia approach. And what this is, I will show here. And this is again a depiction of Porphyry of Tyre, and he was a Phoenician Neoplatonic ontologist or philosopher, and was born in Tyre in Roman Syria. And he used this tree structure to present Aristotle's classification of categories. And this was later adopted in this tree-like diagrams of two-way divisions. And so what we see here is that a species is defined by a genus and a differentiating, and that this logical process continues until the lowest species is reached, and we reach this infirma species or individuals on the modern lingo of the ontologies. So this species can't be divided any further. And a genus, in this sense, serves as the basis of a new definition, and all definitions with the same genus are considered members of the genus. So the principal genus, the summum genus in this Porphyrian tree, is the substance, and substance can be subdivided into differentiate material substances and immaterial substances. And the body is a species of a substance that is material, for instance. And once we have defined this, we get the new genus, the subordinate genus body, which can then be further divided into animate and inanimate species. So the living species is an animate body, and the animal is a sensitive living, and so on. And so we can infer from this that humans are rational, sensitive, animate, material substances. Yeah. So this is just a depiction of a very early form of ontological classification. now the meaning of ontology has changed somewhat. So unlike philosophers, other researchers are not so much, or not primarily interested in the true essence of things. So not at the core of the system, and they're also not discussing if parts within the system are more real than others, or the process, or more real compared to the process that take place within the system. They are more focused on naming parts and processes and grouping similar ones together into categories. And in particular, the information science tries to model a specific and kind of regulated knowledge domain and describe all components, all characteristics inside this knowledge domain, and in particular all the relationships that that are happening inside that knowledge domain. And this is so this is a bit further away from this original ontological description by ontological understanding in philosophy, but it's also due to the fact that nowadays ontologies try to incorporate computable descriptions and try to incorporate machine readability with ontologies. So this is maybe one of the reasons why it kind of got away from this original understanding. And so even in the modern sense, an ontology is a data model, but it's not data. So we have to be clear about that. So it's also not a database, but it's kind of it's purely conceptual. So it's a conceptualization of a particular knowledge domain. So how we can conceptually describe it, but without actually having data inside this ontology. And there is a lot of mixing between different terms. So different terms that maybe sometimes are hiding as ontologies, so kind of masking as ontologies, especially glossaries and controlled vocabularies, but are also very related and very easy to mix up. So I just put up some terms that also describe so let's say a conceptualization of a knowledge domain, but not in such a detail as an ontology. And for example, this glossary is actually typically in natural language that is just derived from normal human speech and interaction. And it's usually just a alphabetical list of terms with definition and explanations, but nothing more than that. And then controlled vocabulary is actually a bit more technical. So this does not just kind of evolve naturally, but this is mostly brought into existence by experts and using expert knowledge to organize information and to provide specific terminology and a catalog to retrieve information. And one of the very famous controlled vocabularies is the mesh controlled vocabulary, basically. But I'll get to that later on. This actually is a kind of a combination of a controlled vocabulary and a hierarchy. And a hierarchy is then just a nested set of terms with a hierarchical relationship between them. And then another form is the taxonomy, which comes from the order law, from the original meaning of that meaning, so of the word, and is typically used to classify organisms. And maybe the most famous taxonomy is the one designed by the Swedish botanist Carolus Linnaeus in the 18th century, and known as the Linnean system of biological classifications. And yeah. So, and then if we go further down, there we get a bit more technical and a bit more to the actual data perspective. So, a knowledge base is then a technology to store complex structured and unstructured information used by computer systems. So here we actually want to have the data inside, unlike the ontology. And a knowledge graph is then a knowledge base that also uses graph structural data or a topology to integrate data. But we get to this graph structured data in a second. So the next big concept I want to talk about, so now that we kind of hopefully defined what an ontology is the semantic web. And this is a so that's a concept that's still hard for me to grasp actually, but I will try to explain the concept and also the principles that are used here. And these are all very important, I think, to know anyways, just as a base. Very important if you want to build your own ontology at some point. And so the semantic web, the concept was introduced by Tim Berners-Lee, one of the co-founders of the World Wide Web, also inventor of the HTML protocol, also inventor of the XML syntax and so on. So kind of a so I'd say one of the most important persons regarding the web technology. And so he postulated in this plenary talk in Geneva that for computers, the web, so the web 1.0 is a flat and boring devoid, so flat, boring, and devoid of meaning for computers. So it's a super, so it's a genius invention for us, for humans, but for computers, the web is kind of boring. And he then wrote a very influential article in 2001 where he kind of explained his idea of the semantic web and also build a roadmap how, in his opinion, we could reach this vision of the semantic web and so on. And he actually wanted to have this, to develop this side by side with the web 1.0. This did not really happen as fast as he, but it's just slowly catching up now. I'm just going to have a look at in the chat. Yeah. So what was the difference between a knowledge graph and ontology again? So it's hard to, so both terms are often used synonymously, but actually from my understanding, an ontology is just the concept of how we would conceptualize and formalize the data, and the knowledge graph then uses this conceptualization to actually store the data as well. So kind of the knowledge graph is kind of the real world appliance of an ontology, if that makes sense.
And I think also an ontology usually also contains logical rules.
Yeah. Not, so, we'll get it. Yeah, I'll explain the rules and the ideas a bit more. Yeah, that's how I would phrase it. Yes, conceptualization versus implementation. Yeah. Okay. And okay, so to maybe get the concept of the semantic web a bit better, I will start actually again a bit more in the past. And so before the internet, for the web 1.0, the whole knowledge was actually stored in so-called document silos. So we had the world full of documents that were stored all over the place. So each researcher had some some documents about this research in, so for example, this original species at some specific location. And the only way to link this was through citations, but the amount of work you had to do to actually link this by yourself was immense, right? I mean, you had to go to the library, you had to find the citation, you had to hope that the library actually had that kind of article. And with the internet, there was also introduced this hyperlink, which is based on HTML and URL. And this hyperlink then allowed documents to be linked together, right? And so these documents were all also at physically different locations, so at different computers, different servers, so on. But what the internet cloud then managed is that we could actually abstract, so an abstraction of the network and machine layer. So as a user of the internet, you didn't have to worry about where this document then actually resided, right? So you could just click on the link, get the information, and so on. So this was already a huge step forward. And I don't think we can think of a time going back without using the internet, really. And then the Web 2.0 is actually a kind of a unsharp definition, but this is often used to describe the era of basically social media, where new applications were introduced and where the input of users was more common. So the content on the internet was not just brought to you by companies and so on, but you could actually change the content by giving information to that applications or by updating sites like Wikipedia or whatever. So the input shifted away from companies and more to the user perspective. But one problem remains. So you still had these application silos, or what they were called. So if you had specific data about a person on LinkedIn, and this data was updated. So, for example, the location of his work changed or so on. This was not automatically updated in Facebook as well. So, regardless of this is a good thing or not, but just the connection between the data, which was obviously the same fact, right? The same data was not introduced yet. And this is actually also a problem for companies. So they have the same problem. The data exists in a single system, and connecting this data silos is extremely expensive. And this was the whole idea of the Web 3.0, so the semantic web, that you go on a deeper level, so that you connect documents not on the document level, but actually on the data level that is inside the documents. And so instead of getting these links, these URLs between different documents that are residing on different servers and so on, you get connections between data and between data that is factual. And I will get to that. What a fact actually means in this context. So again, we have another level of abstraction. So now you don't have to worry about the actual documents or the document layer and the web of documents, but you can just look at the data and look at the connection of the data. And so this allows to share the data directly. So in the example with Facebook and LinkedIn, so the data or the fact where somebody's working, or the fact how old somebody is stored at the data level, at a location, at a uniform, then URI, I'll get to that later. and they don't have to worry about updating their application silos. They just have to link to this particular fact, to this particular data. And this as I said, Tim Berners-Lee actually wanted to want this to develop side by side with the World Wide Web. It just took a bit longer, but it's now on a really good way. So this is the open linked data cloud, one depiction in May 2007. And this is just a depiction of the linked data that is that can be found on this cloud. And what linked data means, I'll get to that in a second. And this is now the linked data cloud in May 2021. And this now includes 1,300 data sets with more than 16,000 links. And these linked data, they define relationships between data, and also a standard format for these relationships. But I'll get to that now, actually. So this is the roadmap that Tim Berners-Lee had in mind in the 1990s, and this is now the semantic web layer code that is currently in place. So it's basically the same thing, but now different principles and different technologies have developed that can actually do these things, so can actually create self-describing documents and provide this proof logic and ontological languages. And I'll get to some of these, which I find the most important. And the first principle that all of this is based on is the URI, so the Uniform Resource Identifier. And this is what I mentioned before with this factual data point. So we have something if two things have the same URI, it's actually the same thing. It's the same object. So you can identify an object without any ambiguity in this semantic web layer cake. And this URI can have a link to a specific location, but it doesn't have to. But what it does is that it names a thing unambiguously. And another concept that's really related to these URIs is the concept of namespaces. And this is actually something that is then used in specific knowledge domains to ensure unique names for the knowledge domain you want to specify. Okay. Yeah, and this is what an URI would then actually look like. So you have the gene symbol for the amyloid beta precursor protein, which is identified with this specific identifier, so the HTNC 620, and also has a lot of other useful information, which is also one of the principles that Tim Berners-Lee actually formulated for URIs, that they have a lot of, at least a lot of useful information. So you have the identifier, you have the name, you have the synonyms, you have previous names, and you have also links to other knowledge bases that describe a similar or the same thing. Well, not the same thing, but where this information is coming from. That is what this ensemble is. And there are also services that again unify these different identifiers over different knowledge domain. That's what this identifiers.org is. And then the XML extensible markup languages, as I said, was invented by Tim Berners-Lee and is a syntax that everyone agreed upon for the semantic web, and describes a tree structure and was designed to improve interoperability by just standardizing this syntax language. And now to the actual ground principle of linked data is this resource description framework, the RDF. And this is based on triples. And each of these triples is then also identified by an URI. And so as triples, you can always build onto. So they can actually, this RDF principle can be used to build graphs then. So you have always this triple of a subject, a predicate, and an object. And each of these is also identified by some URI within some namespace. And yeah, so just a really simple triple. So chain, which is identified in some namespace. Cells, again, predicate identified in some namespace. Cells books, right? And then we have this resource description framework schema, which allows then for a hierarchical building of classes and properties. So this is actually a extension of the RDF framework, and yes, also allows for simple constraints on properties. And this then looks something like this. And if you go to the World Wide Web Consortium websites, you can actually see all the definitions and all the classes and properties that are used for these REF and REFS principles. Yes, so I won't go into detail here, but here just a more small, well, graph that is based on RDF and RDFS. And here you can see that John, who is, so John is named John, and the name, so the naming predicate is defined in this naming URI, which is a RDF property, and is delivered in the string as a string. So the naming of John is delivered as a string. And this is a domain, which means RDFS domain means a domain of the subject property, because John is an individual subject property of a person. And John as this individual, if we go to the hierarchical RDFS layer, is as an individual also a member of the class student, as well as of the class faculty. And both of these classes are actually subclasses of the class person, which is defined as a RDFS class. Okay, so this just is a very simple example of how you can display information in this linked data format. But the interesting thing now is that all of this is machine readable, right? So for us, this would not be so much useful information. That John is named John is something trivial, and also that a student is also a person seems trivial to us, but a machine actually has to learn all those things. So this is what BernersLee meant by a boring plane, the World Wide Web. The machine didn't know what was actually happening semantically in all of these documents and all of these sites. And with this schemas and with this linked data approach, now we can actually define for the machine what's happening here. And a even stronger formalization, or a stronger conceptualization is possible with this web ontology language, OWL, which was also invented by the World Wide Web Consortium. And this also leads to the next section of my talk, how to build ontologies using this web ontology language. And so I have to say, this is not the only language that can be used to build ontologies, and it's also kind of goes against this philosophical ontology approach, right? So that you formalize everything, conceptualize everything in your own ontology. But this is just the standard that makes so one of the standards that make the semantic web actually work, so that everyone adheres to the same standards. And so, yeah. Slide. So this web ontology language is needed for the formalization and conceptualization of your ontology. And the formalization is the process by which we map a conceptualization into a logical representation. So now the actual logical part of the ontology building gets to fruition. So with RDF and RDFS, it was possible to actually build graph-like structures and also to infer some hierarchy, but now we include logics, include description logics into the mix. And to build an ontology with the OWL language, we logically combine so the terms that are inside this ontology to form expressions or axioms, which then have an unambiguous interpretation, and hence can be automatically reasoned upon. So what reasoning is, I'll get to that later. And these logic-based ontologies can be built from concepts and relations. And this description logics then kind of provide the building blocks for the conceptualization of the ontology. And as I said, so there are other web ontology languages or other possibilities to use, or other methodologies to use to building ontologies, which are maybe better suited for specific research questions. But this is what we used for our approach, and is also, I think, it's the most commonly used overall. And the basic building structures of this web ontology language are classes, and a class is a superset or is a set of individuals. So something like a class of trees, which then has different individual instances trees. So tree 1, tree 2, and so on. Different class can be a person with different actual people inside that class. And the membership of a class is dependent on its logical description, not so much on its naming. And a class should usually be built in such a way that it's possible for it to contain individuals. Yes, except you want to represent an empty class, of course. And then individuals is what make up these class. So an individual could be you who's listening, could be Aristotle, or could also be this webinar in a class of presentations, for example. And the individuals are the objects in the domain and can be part of different classes, obviously. And properties are then what relates different classes to another, and also what relates different individuals to another, so where the relationships come in. So with classes, we can have a hierarchical structure, but with the properties, we actually get that relational information that we want in our ontology. And object properties are usually used to relate individuals to one another. With data properties, you can relate individuals to specific data values. And with annotation properties, you can infer more meta information onto individuals or onto classes and so on. And this class expression is then a bit more so we can call normal classes as primitive classes, and these as more advanced classes. Class expression means that a specific class of individuals does not have to be named, right? So we can have a specific class that we name and that we put the individuals into. But a class can also be a logical expression. For example, all things that have the color blue, for example, without actually naming the class of all things that have the color blue. Okay. And now some vocabulary and grammar that that you can use to express more precisely what you mean, and that is specific for this web ontology language. And the first one is disjointness. So you can define classes that have no overlap between each other. So I actually took the liberty to include the pizza ontology from Stanford, which is so I think easy to understand, and also pizza is delicious, and it's quite nice to explain the different vocabulary that's used in the web ontology. And I highly will recommend, if you want to get more into this, check out this tutorial on this website. And yeah, so with disjointness, you can make classes not overlap, so to say. So you have this pizza class, which is disjoint with the topping class, and the soup class of the topping class, so the tomato topping, inherits this disjointness to the pizza class. So because the tomato topping is a subclass of toppings, it can never be part of the pizza class. Then we have some quantifications that we can use within this web ontology language. For example, this existential defines that either an individual or like an individual from one class has to have at least one connection to a individual of another class, if these two are related by a existential relationship. And the same is for universal. Quantification states that an individual from one class that is connected by an universal relationship to another class can only have values from this other class because of this universal relationship. And yeah, you can state exact values that an individual should have, or cardinalities with, yeah, also smaller or bigger than a specific number. Yeah, so this is also quite trivial. So the disjunction is just an OR operator. The negation is, yeah, quite easy. And now we get to some interesting property characteristics that you can use to specify your ontology in more detail, into more logical detail. And one of these is the a specification that a functional object property, and this specifies that for a given individual, there can be at most one individual that is related to the individual via the property. So also called a single valued property. And for this example here, so a man, so the has-wife relationship is a functional one defined by our ontology, but this man has now wife woman 1 and also wife woman 2. And if this functional relationship is true, then we can infer from this relationship that woman 1 and woman 2 have to be the same person, because by the rules of our ontology, a man can only have one wife. So this is also a good example. This is actually an example taken from the World Wide Web Consortium webpage, but just also shows how dependent an ontology can be from socio-demographic or cultural influences, right? So this relationship obviously would be in other cultures would not hold true. Another one is the transitive relationship, which is actually the same as in mathematics. So we have the transitive relation as subregion of. So if Mitte is a subregion of Berlin, and Berlin is also a subregion of Germany, we can infer that Mitte has to be a subregion of Germany as well. Then another one is the symmetric relationship. And this just states that if a property, so for example, this has sibling, is symmetric, it's defined as a symmetric property, and it relates one individual to another, it automatically also relates the individual, so the individual B, so Matt in this instance, to the individual A, Emma. And the same then for the asymmetric or antisymmetric relation is if the property is antisymmetric, then and the property relates one individual to another, the same relationship cannot hold true on the other side. So, for example, something like is child of, right? So if individual A is child of B, B cannot be the child of individual A. And then we have the reflexive and the irreflexive properties, and they just say that with a reflexive relationship, the individual also, the relationship is reflexive when the properties must relate to individual A to himself. And the same is true for irreflexive. So, for example, the reflexive property would be something like knows. So we'd assume that if A knows B, A also has to know himself, probably, if he's not suffering from severe Alzheimer's dementia or so on. And irreflexive, for example, is something like is mother of. So if A is mother of B, and this relationship is irreflexive, A cannot be the mother of herself. Yes. Okay, moving on. So this is another vocabulary that you can use when building your own ontologies. And now to the more complex class expressions. So as I said before, a class expression can be a class or can form a class without actually having to define the name of the class, right? So we have the class pizza, and every individual in this pizza has a pizza base. So we have the relationship of one individual pizza in the class pizza has some base in the pizza base. That's just the way the pizzas are made. But we have other individuals that are part of this has base some pizza base class, which are not pizza. So, for example, this individual could be, I don't know, a crab. Is it pronounced crab? I think so. That uses a pizza base, right? So it would be an individual that has a pizza base, but it's not a pizza. Yeah, this yes would be a more complex class expression, and we can also use and or operators to build class expressions this way. And I mentioned this before also, so reasoners or inference. So by using this logical conceptualization of the ontology, we can actually infer, or the computer can infer information from these constraints and from these logical relationships that we use to build the ontology. And these reasoners, so this is could be a plugin from some software, or could be just a also part from programs, are then used to infer information that is not already explicitly contained within the ontology. Yes, and this can actually lead to contradictions, obviously. So if we actually define classes that logically contradict one another, the reasoner will find this and will infer that this class cannot hold true, and also checks for some other things. So for satisfiability, whether classes can have instances at all, or if they are empty classes, subsumptions. So, for example, this, if we go back, the pizza class would be a subsumption of the has base some pizza base class, because all individuals that are inside the pizza class and have a pizza base are also in the class has base some pizza. And yeah, realization to find the most specific class that an individual belongs to. And now I want to go to the actual application that you can use to build these ontologies. And I think, so this is what we also use to build our virtual brain ontology, the Prodigy, or basically more specifically the web version of this. And this is a free and open source ontology editor, and also provides the framework for building these ontologies. So it can handle RDF, it can handle XML syntax, and so on, and has all these OWL specifications to the logic. And this is also software that uses plugins, so you can download different plugins to the architecture, and which can then be adapted to build both so very simple or also complex ontology-based applications. And this has a quite active community and uses the WWW consortium standards, and also has an extensible source environment. So I don't want to make it sounds like I'm making like a marketing for Protégé, but I just liked. Yeah, and this is what this looks like. I don't know why, but for some reason, all ontology software and also most ontology visualization programs look like they came straight from Windows 1997. I don't know why that is. Yeah, but you can see here you have a lot of different tabs that you can use. You can go into the classes and see then the class hierarchy. If you click on one of the classes, you can then actually look at the label and look at the different class expressions that are used for this class. For example, here now for the Siciliana class, which is one of the named pizzas. So here is a subclass of the named pizzas. It states here that it has to have toppings that are out of this out of these different topics. So it can only have toppings that are anchovies, artichoke, and so on. And also states that each individual of the Siciliana pizza has to have toppings, at least one of these each. It can have more than one, but it has to have all of these to be individual of the Siciliana pizza class. Yeah. We go to the next. This is basically then the same information, just now displayed in a with the ontograph plugin. So with the graph view, and this is the same information that we had before. So the Siciliana class is a subclass of the name pizza, and has this class expression. So has to be a subclass of the class expression, has topping of all of these different toppings that make up a Siciliana pizza. And here it's displayed the same thing in the XML markup language, where you also have the Siciliana class, which is defined as a OWL class and subclass of the name pizza, and with all the class expression restrictions. So so this has to have at least one topping with anchovies, has to have one topping with artichoke, and has to have one topping with garlic topping, and so on. I didn't in the whole XML file, but the idea. Okay, so this sums up the section about the semantic web and what you can do with it, or with some of the what you can do with some of the principles of the semantic web, so with the RDF-based OWL web ontology language. And now to the next section about actual biological applications or example ontologies that I find interesting or let's say well made in this context. And so where can you find these ontologies? There's actually a lot of different possibilities, but I think the most comprehensive repository is this bio portal, where you can find which you can find on this link, and they have 930 ontologies out of the life sciences that are all curated. So you have to have a certain standard to be published here. Overall, with over 13 million classes and over 30,000 properties. And for vocabularies, you can use this linked data vocabulary site, which has over 700 different vocabularies. And another good lookup service is this OLS, the Ontological lookup service, where you can type in different ontologies and then skim through the tree structure, look at all the different cross-references with the definitions and so on. And it's just a bit visually more appealing than Prodigy, and you don't have to actually download the whole ontology file. It's all in this lookup service website. But basically, it also has, I think, most of the ontologies that's also in the bio portal. And so the reason why I will show you these two ontologies, the next two ontologies. So this is a comic that you probably know already. It's about standards, but you can just replace standards with ontologies, basically in a specific knowledge field. So you have the situation that you have 4 competing, let's say, anatomical ontologies, or 14 competing ontologies that describe the knowledge domain of genes and their functions. And now they found this ridiculous and obviously want to define one universal standard, one universal ontology to cover this all. And now we have 15 competing ontologies in this field. And so this gene ontology is arguably maybe one of the most successful ontology projects in the life sciences. And this has so millions of annotations, hundreds of thousands of genes using these Go terms. And in essence, it was crafted to handle exactly this problem I showed in this comic before. So handle a problem where many different biological databases try to craft their own terms and describe genes and their functionalities their own ways. And specifically, each species database tried to describe and explain genes on their own. And this gene ontology consortium then came together and find a common and systematic vocabulary to be used independently of species and to combine all of this knowledge into one comprehensive ontology. And yeah, you can just see all the annotations, all the gene products that are included here. It's a graph that just shows that the annotation of gene ontology is steadily increasing in publications. And here's a graph that shows the different evidence degrees, or where this annotational evidence is coming from. So philo, for example, is phylogenetic evidence, taken from experimental evidence, or and this HTP is actually just a small percentage is taken from high throughput data experiments. Yeah. And so what this gene ontology then does gives you, or basically defines types used to describe gene function. And it classifies functions along 3 main aspects. And these are the molecular function. So what gene products do, then these cellular components, so where these gene products operate. So for example, if it's inside the Golgi system, or if it's inside presynaptic or postsynaptic in the central nervous system, and also defines the biological process. So the pathways and the processes that gene products participate in. And yeah, so this is a snapshot from the Amigo tool, where you can go through this gene ontology, and you see also that each term is, so for example, is defined, and can also be can be displayed in its nested hierarchy. So learning or memory. So this is very far up from far away from the actual gene function, but like very downstream. The learning memory is defined as a cognition, which is part of a neurological system process, which itself is also part of the system process, and so on. So all back to the overarching superclass of biological processes. So very comprehensive, very good ontology, good example of how to build an ontology. And the next one is Uberon, who also basically did this, but in another knowledge domain. So this is the knowledge domain of anatomical knowledge. And there was also the problem that there were many competing ontologies, especially also competing ontologies from different species. And Uberon managed with a very, again, comprehensive methodology to link all of this information from different anatomical ontologies to build one overarching and integrative multi-species ontology. And they did this by defining anatomical classes that can that then relate to one another in such a way that they can integrate the different properties in the different classes and the different definitions of other ontologies to link all this up. And yeah, this is just an example. One of the classes inside the Uberon ontology. So we have the primary visual cortex, which is not finished. Yes. Which is a functional part of the brain, but it's also Brodmann area. So, for example, for the primary visual cortex, it's Brodmann area 17, I think, and which is itself, but also then the primary visual cortex is part of the visual cortex, also describing the different layers of the visual cortex and all of these different relationships. And the next application of bioontologies, so this is a bit, it's a bit different approach. It's not really an ontology, I would say, but it's also maybe more or less competing with the RDF and OWL system. So this is the biological expression language. L, which was introduced by the Fraunhofer Institute, in particular the Fraunhofer Institute for Scientific Computing. And what they are trying to do, they're trying to represent the whole scientific knowledge, so the knowledge that is contained in the semantics of scientific literature, to extract this and then to use it to build knowledge graphs. And the way they are extracting this knowledge is by using existing ontologies and vocabularies, or partly also by creating new controlled vocabularies themselves to scan the biomedical scientific literature using text mining. And this has obviously some features. So I'm not sure about this easy to learn, but it's definitely computable. So the end product is then also a knowledge graph in the form of triplets between different biological entities that are linked through relationships. Maybe I can give you one example from the Bell web page. So you have this scientific snippet. So shear stress enhances expression of the gene encoding the endothelial nitric oxide synthase and so on. So the this is what they're trying to express with Bell expressions. And what they found is here the response to fluid shear stress. So this is what the first sentence mentions, and they annotated this with the gene ontology. Obviously a good choice because I like the gene ontology, but to expand on this, so they also defined with this BP what this actually is. So it's not just the concept of the response to fluid shear stress, but it's the biological process of this concept. And this response to fluid shear stress then increases the RNA abundance of the NOS3, so the nitric oxide synthase 3 gene, which is annotated in this Hugo Gene Nomenclature Committee namespace. So this is the first sentence, and also this biological process also increases the activity of the molecular activity of the catalase part of this gene. This is what here further stimulates its enzymatic activity, leading to physiologically low concentrations. So yeah, so this biological process also increases the activity of the catalase molecular activity of the gene NOS3. And this then in turn is what I just read is leading to physiological low concentrations of nitric oxide within endothelial cells. So this increased activity of the catalase then directly increases the abundance or the abundance of the nitric oxide molecule, which is then annotated in the CHEBI, which is the chemical entities of biological interest namespace. And this continuous generation of NO prevents the apoptosis of endothelial cells, thereby protecting the endothelial monolayer from injury. This increase in nitric oxide then decreases the apoptotic process, again annotated in the gene ontology as a biological process. So you can see there's obviously a lot of information in these two sentences, and also this is a very nice, in my opinion, very nice formalization of this. So it's it provides all of the information that's inside there in a triple form. So this can be machine readable and can be used to build knowledge graphs or so on. And it's way more concise and way more condensed than this whole semantic layer, obviously. But what's also obvious is that the actual annotation and the actual meaning of each of these triples is not completely unambiguous. So this would work perfectly if the authors who actually wrote this article directly transfer this into the biological expression language. But as this has not happened in the past, and this has to be done post hoc, so to say, with this text mining, this also includes a lot of manual curation, and all of these annotations, all of these namespaces have to be checked again and again to see if these are actually the best suiting ones. And also, as I said before, there is so the gene ontology is a good example. Uberon is also a good example, but there are a lot of different ontologies, a lot of different controlled vocabularies that are competing in the same knowledge domains. So it's not always so easy to know which annotation to use in this case. And as I said, this this approach is highly dependent on text mining. Oops, what's happening here? I don't know. Okay. So, and one of the tools they're using for this text mining is, or what then comes out of this text mining is Skyview, which is actually medical literature repository, very much like PubMed. But the difference is that all of the literature, all of the semantic text inside of this knowledge base has been annotated with these text mining tools, with ProMiner in particular. And this means that you already have inside of these documents the annotated words, or the annotated semantics that are linked to a specific knowledge base or a specific ontology. For example, here the Uberon ontologies and all of the anatomical terms that are inside this literature have been annotated with this Uberon ontology. And this is what Sky then uses to build these knowledge graphs. And as I said, because it's so intensive for curation, they have not built, let's say, a knowledge graph for the whole scientific literature, biomedical literature, but okay, I have to hurry up, sorry. Just did it for specific use cases, and one of these use cases is the NeuroMMSig, which is a knowledge graph view for neurodegeneration. And so they built a knowledge graph within a specific knowledge domain. In this case, it was Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and epilepsy, and used the Sky view and also used a terminology system that they themselves created, the pathway terminology system, to find interactions between these different bell terms that are all linked to a specific pathway. So they want to try, they want to find mechanisms. They want to find relations within a specific pathway terminology system. And okay, this also included a lot of manual creation. And if you want, you can check this out. Also, they have a quite nice GUI, which is a bit hard to get used to, but there you can also go into these graphs that have been made by literature mining and by this biological expression language, and that consist of very different layers. So, I mean, it's all the same dimensional layer, but the entity layers are very different. So you have genes, you have proteins, but you also have molecules, you have whole diseases that are all connected via this literature mining approach. And what this then enables actually to find kind of mechanistic relations between different entities. Right? So you have built all these, you've text mined the literature, and you found all these relationships to build a graph. And this then helps you to explain relationships far down the road. So for example, if you're interested in what entities all lead to a positive regulation of the synaptic plasticity in the context of Alzheimer's disease, you see here that different entities contribute, but actually go through these kind of waypoints, which are mostly connected to R-beta, right? R-beta, APP, the amyloid precursor protein. Yeah. Okay, so now to the last part of this webinar, so to the presentation. How can we actually use all of this knowledge, and how can we link this to brain simulations, especially brain simulations with the virtual brain? And for this, we first had to bring the virtual brain into the ontological world, into the ontological space, and we did this by, as I said, using Prodigy, or this web version of Prodigy. And we created, or are still in the process of creating, a whole description of all entities that make up the virtual brain. And this is, I can't see I just noticed, sorry, just noticed that you can't see my mouse if I go into this presenter mode. Okay, never mind. So just very shortly, the three main components of the virtual brain to build a brain network model: the local neural dynamics, which are made up by the dynamics which come from the neural mass models, which are basically a set of differential equations. Here, for example, the Janssen-Ritt model, a more biologically based model, which are then linked. So in each node of the virtual brain, the local dynamics are happening, and these are then linked by the individual connectivities measured with, for example, DTI MRI, to build then a whole brain model which is linked by this global connectivity function. So depending on the structural connectivity, and the what you're using as global scaling functions. And what we saw, what the most, what the best, well, the first problem obviously was to get this all in the. Now it's working again. Okay, so to standardize this, to formalize this, and also to formalize this with the given limitations that we have from the web ontology language. So it's not. You can use logics, but you can't easily describe, for example, something like a sigmoidal function or something with owl expressions, obviously. So we couldn't manage to actually describe the dynamics, the local differential equations in its whole with all of its difficulties, but we had to kind of limit what we can express mathematically with this ontology. But this was only one part, so describing the mathematics. But we also tried to describe the meaning.
Interruption. We had one question referring to this.
Oh, yeah.
Who is actually doing the manual creation? So I can just say that parts of our team are doing this, and actually these are not unpaid students. It's more the most of those who work on the TVB ontology have also experience in simulations with TVB. So actually we take a lot of, we care a lot that we can maintain the highest quality there. So and we also plan concepts for the long-term quality control after finishing it. So these are definitely aspects we are addressing.
Yeah, definitely. And as I said, it's an ongoing process, obviously.
Sure. And there's another question about how will these annotation languages such as Spell play an important role as self-supervised methods become more sufficient to capture the semantic meaning of a raw material? So actually, I think it's about how if they will get more important as the extraction of semantics will get automized more and more.
Yeah. So as I said, there are tools that try to automatize this translation from semantics from the literature just directly into Bell statements. But as far as I know, this is still not in a stage where you can just trust the results without manual operation. But I think so. This is also obviously a machine learning problem. So as more and more people are actually curating their own scientific articles, this approach will obviously get better. And maybe at some point it's so good that we can actually translate the whole scientific literature into this graph-like structure. And it's very interesting what we can learn from this transdiagnostically.
Yeah, but actually we have to mention that at the current state, I think probably Konstantin, you would agree, the most automized thing that we have seen is a hybrid model where you first have machine learning to automatically grab things, and afterwards you need a manual equation to check those findings. this is, I think, for now we are not more accurate than this.
Yeah. Okay, so I have to hurry. No, thanks. Okay, just to display. So, for example, this parameter b is already with a lot of annotation and taken from the original publications by Janssen Ritt. This is then the maximum amplitude of the inhibitory postsynaptic potential. And so this is what I meant. So the annotation or the relationships we found are threefold. So the first is these mathematical relations where we confine to displaying what parameters are actually parameters in the dynamical sense, and which parameters are used as state variables, so variables that are dependent on time and that change obviously over the dynamic of the model, and then also which parameters are also coefficient of state variables. And what we can also differentiate is what are functions and what are arguments of those functions mathematically. And then I think what is maybe more in the scope of such an ontology is the dynamical meaning of these parameters, which is obviously also something that you can learn from reading the papers, but it's not that obvious, and it's also a lot of work to get to the bottom of this. So this is, I think, one of the most beneficial things that we already have inside of this ontology, to find overarching parameter categorizations that different parameters from different models fall into. So, for example, this inhibitory postsynaptic potential is obviously the parameter catalog for inhibition, but is also an inhibition bound, and we will see later on that different parameters from different models fall into this category, this parameter catalog. And then I think the most let's say experimental, but also the relationship that has the most potential is then the relationship to biological surrogates. So most of these models, not all of them, some are phenomenological, but most are biologically based. So they are they're coming from neurophysiological studies. They're coming from single neuron models. So most of these parameters actually have a biophysical or biological meaning, and this we also extracted from the publications and then linked it to these biological surrogates. For example, this inhibitory postsynaptic potential, which is the label, which is the definition of the parameter, was then linked to the inhibitory postsynaptic potential, which was annotated in the mesh thesaurus, which is the correct description of this. And we chose mesh because this is one of the most widely used thesauri or controlled vocabularies word-wise. If you don't know mesh, this is the yeah. So it's a hierarchical structured summation of terms which can be used to use as keywords to describe the publication you just published. So if your publication is about Alzheimer's disease and some specific receptor, you can use these keywords to clarify more with this controlled vocabulary what the research is actually about. And
one short warning. It's you have 3 minutes left.
3 minutes.
Okay.
Sorry, I dragged a bit in the beginning, and now I have to rush. I'm sorry for this. Yes, so for all parameters where this was possible, we tried to find these surrogates, so this connection to the biological meaning. Yeah, that's just an expression of what parameters can all be used as inputs, but I'll skip this. And what we want to actually achieve by this, to create this ontological loop, right? So we have these knowledge bases like neuro and SIG displayed in this biological expression language that already gives us a lot of mechanistic insights and mechanistic explanations of biological pathways of biological processes, that are disease specific, and because a lot of these terms, because a lot of these entities that are used as nodes inside these knowledge graphs, we can directly, just by this surrogate of connection, can directly connect parameters of TVB with mesh terms, which are then also used inside these knowledge bases. And with this connection, we now have, if, for example, we are looking at a specific mechanism in the context of Alzheimer's disease, and we see that a specific specific receptor type or so on is causally involved in this, we can relate this to the corresponding parameter in TVB, and then, for example, try to run simulations to try to in silico explain this mechanism better. Or maybe we have a hypothesis from this knowledge base that we can test then in TVB using TVBO. Yeah, so this is the idea of the ontological loop, and this is maybe a bit more detail what we're trying to achieve. So going one I'm already over the time, but maybe just two sentences to this. If we go one layer above this, so abstract from the knowledge base space and the TVO, but actually look at empirical data, and then try to first translate this empirical data of an individual into some candidate mechanism, which is possible, obviously, right? If, for example, the PET signal can be connected to maybe reduced glucose metabolism, or in a slower frequency in the EEG can be connected to neural slowing, or less strong structural MRI can be connected via these knowledge graphs to disconnection of the different nodes inside the brain. And if we then translate this into a surrogate mechanism, or maybe even translate it directly into parameters with TVB, but particularly if we translate it in these surrogate mechanisms, we can use TVB to then infer this candidate mechanisms directly into the equations of TVB. And what this then does, we can then test with the inferred knowledge from the knowledge bases and with the empirical data we actually got from on the individual level, we can then test first in an internal validation if we alter these parameters that we use as a surrogate mechanism, as a mathematical correlate of what we expect from the empirical data, we can see if this actually leads to the candidate mechanisms in the first step in the internal validation, if it's plausible, and then in the empirical validation, if we can actually see the differences that we saw on the individual empirical data. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I'm sorry I had to rush this a bit more complicated part in the end. I will skip the last slides, which are basically just saying that this inferring information onto parameters inside the equations of the virtual machine is not only possible with knowledge bases or knowledge from knowledge bases, but it is also possible with actual empirical data. Also, for example, if we have alterations in receptor density data, we can also infer this directly into the equations of TVB and see what happens to the dynamics. Okay, so then thank you for your attention. These are the references I use and also the resources that you can check out if you want. And yeah, sorry it took a bit longer. And if you have questions, you can ask them or support them, put them into the chat.
Thank you, Konstantin, for this really interesting and really immense talk about from philosophy to gene ontologies. So actually, I think first I will just stop the recording.